They weren't just cheap meals. They were lifelines served on scratched Formica tables, quietly holding together the dignity of America's forgotten working class. What sacred comfort did we lose when we stopped eating the food that once fed our hardest years? In the quiet chaos of the 1970s, when paychecks stretched thin and every dime had a destiny, tuna noodle casserole was the supper that never let you down. This was not the kind of food that bragged, but it stuck to your ribs and stayed in your memory. Picture a kitchen lit by a single bulb, children laughing in the living room, and the smell of tuna noodle casserole wrapping itself around the house like a worn wool blanket. Back then, canned tuna was cheap and dependable, a protein that did not ask for much. Egg noodles, buttery and familiar, filled the plate with a softness that reminded you that not everything in the world had to be hard. And cream of mushroom soup, thick, salty, dependable, held it all together like a family secret passed down in whispers. You might top it with crushed potato chips if you had them, but even without, the taste brought a strange sense of comfort, like the world outside could wait a little longer. Nobody called it fancy, but it showed up again and again, a quiet testimony to survival and stubborn joy. In homes where fathers came home late from second shifts and mothers made magic with half a pantry, this was the meal that asked for nothing but gave you everything. That casserole dish, faded from years of use, carried more than just food. It carried love you could eat with a spoon. Porcupine meatballs were strange little miracles, humble spheres of ground beef and white rice, simmering in a bath of tomato sauce that smelled like home. The name made kids laugh, but the taste made them quiet. These were the kinds of suppers that worked behind the scenes, holding families together while the world kept pushing in from every side. They were called porcupine because the rice poked through like little spines, but nobody cared about the looks. It was about stretching meat when meat was scarce, and rice was cheap and filling. Mothers learned it from pamphlets, from neighbors, from church potlucks, and made it their own. The tomato sauce turned sharp ingredients soft, mellowed out by slow simmering and kitchen patience. You might have had them with green beans from a can, or just bread soaked in sauce. There was no need to pretend they were fancy. They were enough. Enough to feed a family. Enough to say, "We'll get through this." The meat was never prime, the rice sometimes overcooked, but none of that mattered. Because the memory of sitting at the table, your legs swinging just above the floor, eating a plate of those soft little meatballs that stays with you longer than the taste ever did. The smell still lingers in old kitchens and secondhand cookbooks, waiting to be remembered. Chipped beef on toast was not just food, it was survival dressed in a white sauce. They called it creamed chipped beef, or sometimes just SOS, a nickname too crude to repeat in polite company, but everybody knew it. Born on military bases and carried home in memory, it found its place in working-class kitchens across America. Dried beef from a jar, thick white gravy made from flour and milk, poured over stale toast and served like it was a blessing. Because in many homes, it was. The beef was thin and salty, not exactly tender, but when you had little else, it felt rich. That sauce was a small luxury, thickened by a whisk and a mother's tired hands. There was something defiant about it, a meal that refused to disappear even when money did. It fed factory workers and school children, it showed up at breakfast and dinner, and always said, "This is enough." There were no secrets, no frills, just a dish that got the job done. And yet, in its simplicity, there was care, a kind of military honesty, a no-nonsense meal in a no-nonsense time. Even if you hated it, you remembered it. And sometimes, that is the most honest kind of nostalgia there is. Sloppy Joes never asked for permission to be messy. They just were. And in that mess, saucy, sweet, tangy, and served on soft hamburger buns, you found the kind of joy that only kids with stained shirts and sauce-covered faces really understood. These sandwiches were the chaos of childhood, the fast fix after a long day, the supper that did not care about table manners. Ground beef browned in a pan, mixed with ketchup, mustard, a splash of vinegar, and a spoonful of brown sugar, maybe onions if you were lucky. Or unlucky, depending on who you asked. It was a dish that felt like a joke at first. Sloppy food for a sloppy world. But under the name was a recipe that worked. It was cheap, it was filling, and it made you feel like you had something special. It tasted like baseball nights and paper plates. Like birthday parties that did not have cake but always had enough to eat. It did not need sides, but it went well with whatever was in the cupboard. Corn, chips, or just the other half of the bun. In the world of working-class food, sloppy joes were a small rebellion. Against hunger, against silence, against the idea that dinner had to be neat to be good. They made a mess. And sometimes that is exactly what a good meal should do. Macaroni and tomatoes was the kind of dish that could only have been born in hardship and stayed around because it was loved. There was nothing glamorous about it. Elbow macaroni boiled until soft, then stirred into stewed tomatoes with a generous knob of butter, salt, pepper, and not much else. But somehow it worked. Somehow it was enough. This was a meal that made you sit still. A meal that smelled like your grandmother's stove and tasted like every dinner you never thought to miss until now. In some homes, it was Sunday supper. In others, it was Monday's leftovers made new. It was comfort food that never got called that back then. Just, what's for dinner? White bread on the side was almost guaranteed, the kind that left crumbs on the table and stuck to the roof of your mouth. You might add a bit of cheese if you were lucky, but the original was humble. This was not about flavor explosions or recipe perfection. It was about sitting around a table and being fed, being full, being together. And in that simplicity, there was a kind of magic you cannot buy now, even if you tried. TV dinners were not just meals, they were moments. Packaged in foil trays, pulled from the freezer with a kind of reverence, they promised more than just food. They promised time. Time to sit in front of the television, legs crossed on the carpet, with a plastic fork in hand and your favorite show flickering in front of you. Each tray had its sections: meat with brown gravy, mashed potatoes with a crater of margarine, peas or corn that somehow tasted frozen even when hot, and a tiny dessert you always ate first. It was not gourmet, it was barely warm sometimes, but it was yours. And for a child in the 1970s, eating a TV dinner meant independence. It meant being part of a modern world, even if just for 20 minutes. For parents, it meant one less pot to clean, one less battle to fight. And sure, the meat was tough and the peas were weird, but that did not matter. What mattered was the experience, the novelty, the quiet miracle of having dinner without having to make it. In a decade filled with hard choices, TV dinners offered one easy one. And sometimes, that was enough to feel okay for just a little while. Meatloaf with ketchup glaze was not just a dish, it was a ritual. Every family had their version, passed down or made up, and somehow they all tasted like home. Ground beef stretched with breadcrumbs and eggs, seasoned with whatever was left in the spice rack, shaped into a loaf and topped with a thick smear of sweet ketchup, then baked until the glaze bubbled and caramelized at the edges. This was not fancy food. It was not supposed to be. It was designed to last, to satisfy, to keep you going. It fed families through layoffs and long winters, and it tasted better on day 2, sliced cold and slapped between 2 slices of bread. Some added onions, some added oatmeal, some swore by the secret of a splash of milk or a dash of Worcestershire sauce. But it was never about the ingredients. It was about the intention. Meatloaf said, "You matter enough for me to shape something by hand and make it last." It was a meal you could smell from the hallway, and it always pulled you to the table. Whether you loved it or barely tolerated it, you remembered it. And maybe that is what gives a meal its weight. Not the flavor, but the memory. Hamburger Helper was a miracle in a box. You added ground beef, water, and a little hope, and 30 minutes later, you had dinner. It came in flavors like cheeseburger macaroni, beef stroganoff, and lasagna, each with their own dusty little packet of magic. It was not gourmet, and it did not pretend to be. But when you were working full-time and raising kids on a threadbare budget, that little box meant everything. It meant one less thing to worry about. It meant your children would go to bed full, and even if they complained, they still cleaned their plates. Hamburger Helper was a symbol of the 70s, convenient, dependable, and proudly unpretentious. It fed millions. It made weekday meals possible. And in doing so, it earned its place in the kitchen cupboards of America. The packaging may have changed, but the memory never does. That skillet on the stove, bubbling with pasta and beef and something that tasted like comfort. It is burned into the memory like a family photo. Chicken and dumplings was the closest a meal ever got to a warm hug. It started with a broth, rich and savory, bubbling with tender bits of chicken. Then came the dumplings, soft, doughy, clouds that soaked up every drop of flavor like they were made for it. And maybe they were. Maybe they were made to carry the weight of tired hands and empty wallets. This dish was not about precision. It was about patience. It was about stirring slowly, seasoning carefully, and trusting that flour and fat and a little time could feed a family of 5. It filled the kitchen with steam and the house with peace. And in a time when peace was hard to come by, that mattered more than anything. You did not need fresh herbs or fine china, just a pot, a ladle, and people to serve. Chicken and dumplings said, everything is going to be okay, even when it was not. And maybe that is why we still crave it, even now. Goulash was America's answer to too many mouths and not enough money. A one-pot wonder of elbow macaroni, ground beef, tomato sauce, and whatever spices had not run out yet. It was not Hungarian goulash, though the name gave it a bit of foreign flair. This was something else, something ours. It cooked fast, stretched far, and tasted better the longer it sat. Some added corn, some added beans, others kept it simple. It did not matter. What mattered was how it fed everyone. Big portions, big comfort. You could find it in school cafeterias, church potlucks, and Wednesday night dinners all across the country. It was the flavor of the middle class, hearty, red, and slightly overcooked, and it stuck with you. In a world that often asked too much, goulash gave everything it had, and that made it unforgettable. Spam and eggs was the morning meal of those who had little time, little money, but still wanted to start the day with something warm. That metal can, with its unmistakable pop and salty perfume, was a fixture on the counter in countless kitchens. Spam did not pretend to be fancy. It was a slab of meat that laughed in the face of labels. Sliced thick, fried until the edges crisped and curled, it sat next to scrambled eggs like an old friend who never judged. And the eggs, sometimes fresh, sometimes powdered, were fluffed just enough to give you the illusion of plenty. This was the kind of breakfast that filled bellies before school and work, when the house still smelled like sleep and the only sound was the sizzle from the pan. It was fast, it was cheap, and it worked. In many homes, it was the meal you had on the mornings that really mattered. The test day, the double shift, the long ride ahead. Spam and eggs never won awards, but it never needed to. It showed up. It stayed reliable. And for all its simplicity, it left behind the kind of warmth that never really fades. Fried bologna sandwiches were what you made when you had nothing, but still wanted to feel like you had something. That first hiss when the cold slice hit the hot skillet, that was the sound of supper on its way. It would blister in the middle, curl at the edges like a flower unfolding, and take on this irresistible smoky scent that pulled kids into the kitchen. You'd slap it on white bread. No toasting, no ceremony. Maybe add mustard if you had it, cheese if it was payday. Sometimes you'd eat it plain, greasy fingers and all. It was food that did not apologize. Food that made the most out of the least. In houses where dinner had to be stretched across 4 mouths and 1 paycheck, fried bologna was a minor miracle. You did not need a recipe. You needed a pan and patience. It was fast, it was salty, and it tasted like something you were not supposed to enjoy. But you always did. Adults called it poor man's meat, but kids just called it good. In a world full of gourmet nonsense, fried bologna still tastes like a simpler kind of pride. Fish sticks and tartar sauce made Friday night dinners feel almost like a celebration. Pulled from the freezer and laid out on a metal tray, they were golden, breaded promises of a meal that was both easy and somehow still special. These were not fresh catches or ocean delicacies. They were chopped white fish, frozen solid, and ready in 20 minutes. And they were perfect. Because they were familiar. Because they were dependable. That crunch when you bit in, followed by the soft, steamy center, was as comforting as any casserole. You dipped them in tartar sauce, maybe from a jar, maybe homemade with mayo and pickles, and suddenly dinner felt whole. There might be canned peas on the side or a scoop of macaroni and cheese, and together it all made sense. Fish sticks were the great equalizer. Rich or poor, city or country, they showed up in everyone's kitchens. Parents loved them because they were quick. Kids loved them because they were crispy. And somewhere in the middle, we all came to see them as more than just a convenience food. They were the shortcut to a meal that worked. And in a decade where time and money were always short, that meant everything. Creamed chipped beef on toast, still sometimes whispered as SOS long after the war, was the kind of dish that carried 1,000 stories. It came from barracks and military mess halls, but by the 1970s, it had found its way into the everyday American kitchen. Thin slices of dried beef, soaked in a thick, pale gravy, poured generously over toast that was usually a little too dry. It was not pretty, it was not subtle, but it was food that filled you up when nothing else would. The beef was salty, the cream sauce was heavy, and together they made something you could eat standing over the sink or serve at a crowded table. It had an odd kind of prestige in its lack of pretension. Every bite said, "This will do." It was the meal of last resorts that somehow became a tradition. And whether you loved it or hated it, you never forgot the nights you ate it. Creamed chipped beef was more than a recipe. It was a memory that lingered in every can of dried meat, every thick roux, every reused slice of day-old bread. Beef stroganoff felt like a peek into something fancy, even when made on a shoestring budget. The idea of it, tender beef in a creamy mushroom sauce over buttery egg noodles, sounded like something you would get in a restaurant, not a cramped kitchen with dollar store pots. But the magic of the 1970s was making elegance out of limitations. Families used the cheapest cuts of beef, browned quickly in a pan, then smothered them in condensed mushroom soup or sour cream. The sauce would bubble thick, cling to every noodle, and carry that rich umami flavor that made your shoulders drop after the first bite. It was hearty without being heavy, creamy without being complicated. Sometimes you added onions, sometimes paprika, but mostly you kept it simple. This was not a dinner you rushed. You made it on nights when you wanted to pretend a little. Pretend you were somewhere else. Pretend you had more. And in that pretense, you created something real. Comfort, satisfaction, and the quiet joy of knowing you had made something out of almost nothing. Quiche Lorraine was the pie that made people feel like they were part of something bigger, something continental. It came from France, or so the cookbook said, but in the 1970s, it found its place in American kitchens, surrounded by Tupperware and flower print aprons. Eggs, cream, crispy bacon, and shredded cheese, all baked into a flaky crust that somehow held it all together. It felt fancy, but it was forgiving. You could swap out ingredients, use what you had, and it would still come out golden. This was brunch food before brunch became a trend. It showed up at potlucks, baby showers, and quiet Sunday mornings when nobody was in a rush. It was the dish that made mothers feel like chefs and kids feel like they were getting away with eating pie for dinner. And maybe they were. Quiche Lorraine taught a generation that sophistication did not have to be expensive. It could come from a cracked ceramic dish and a hot oven, too. Chicken a la king sounded royal, but it was really a throne made of cream and leftovers. This dish was how you turned yesterday's chicken into tonight's triumph. Chopped white meat, soft mushrooms, and bits of green pepper swimming in a thick, buttery sauce. Sometimes you spooned it over toast, sometimes over rice, and sometimes over biscuits if you really wanted to feel rich. It was smooth, savory, and impossibly filling. The sauce turned even the driest meat into something tender. Chicken a la king came from fancier roots, but the 1970s made it a workhorse meal, good for tight budgets and tired cooks. You could dress it up or dress it down, and either way, it filled the house with the smell of something that mattered. And in homes where the paycheck barely made it to Friday, that was enough. Corned beef hash was the breakfast that turned scraps into salvation. Diced potatoes, salty corned beef, and onions all fried together until golden and crisp on the edges. It was greasy in the best way, the kind of food that stuck with you all day. You could top it with a fried egg if you had one, let the yolk run and mix into the hash like melted gold. It was comfort from a can and courage from a skillet. No one cared that the meat was canned. No one cared that the potatoes were last week's leftovers. What mattered was the sizzle, the smell, and that first forkful. Corned beef hash was not pretty, but it was honest. It told the truth about your fridge and made it work anyway. Tater tot casserole was what happened when the freezer and pantry held hands. You started with ground beef, maybe browned with onions, maybe not, mixed it with condensed cream of mushroom soup, and poured it into a dish like it was an offering. Then came the tater tots, lined up in perfect rows like little golden soldiers ready for the oven. You baked it until the tops were crispy, the insides hot, and the whole thing smelled like a school night in the middle of winter. It was not elegant, but it was engineered for love. The crunchy top, the creamy middle, the savory meat, it all worked together to make you feel like everything was going to be okay. Tater tot casserole was the kind of meal that knew what you needed before you did. Stuffed bell peppers were like little edible packages of hope. Each one stood upright in a baking dish, filled to the brim with a mix of ground beef, white rice, and seasoned tomato sauce. The peppers softened in the oven, turning tender while still holding their shape like proud green soldiers. You cut into one and steam poured out, carrying the scent of garlic, onion, and everything good. Some families added cheese, others kept it plain, but every version was a love letter to thrift and tradition. It was a meal that made you slow down, sit up straight, and savor. Stuffed bell peppers were not a side. They were the whole show. Salisbury steak was dinner dressed in its Sunday best, even if it was just Tuesday and you were eating on a TV tray. Ground beef shaped into thick ovals, seasoned like steak, then pan-seared and drowned in a dark, glossy gravy. It was the kind of meal that made kids sit up straight and adults exhale after a long day. Mashed potatoes were its loyal partner, soaking up the gravy like a sponge, so nothing went to waste. Sometimes there were green beans on the side, sometimes just a slice of white bread to mop the plate. Salisbury steak wasn't a luxury, it was a trick. A way to turn plain ground beef into something with presence. It pretended to be steak in a world where real steak was often too expensive. But nobody complained. In fact, most families welcomed it with open arms and full forks. It was hearty. It was simple. And it always filled the house with the smell of something good. You didn't ask for seconds because it was fancy. You asked because it made you feel full in more ways than one. Pasta Primavera was the dish that whispered, "Let's try something new," during a decade still learning what new could taste like. It wasn't smothered in sauce or packed with meat. Instead, it celebrated the humble joy of vegetables, carrots, broccoli, bell peppers, lightly sautéed and tossed with warm pasta. The colors alone felt like springtime in a bowl. In homes used to meat and potato dinners, Pasta Primavera was a gentle nudge toward freshness. It said you could eat light and still be satisfied, that you could serve something green and it could still taste like comfort. The seasoning was simple: olive oil, garlic, salt, and maybe a sprinkle of Parmesan if it was a good week. It was the kind of dish that made mothers feel modern and kids feel curious, a sign that even on a tight budget, you could cook with hope and maybe, just maybe, start to change what dinner looked like. Salmon patties were how you turned a dusty can from the back of the cupboard into something golden and proud. You'd mix that flaky pink fish with breadcrumbs, a cracked egg, a dash of onion, maybe a squeeze of lemon if you had it. Form them into thick little rounds and drop them into a hot skillet until they sizzled and browned at the edges. They smelled stronger than you remembered. But the taste? Crispy on the outside, warm and soft inside, with a flavor that somehow made sense of its strangeness. Salmon patties were resourceful, they were economical, and they filled the plate in a way that said, "This is dinner, not a compromise." Maybe you served them with mashed potatoes. Maybe you just ate them over white rice with a splash of ketchup. It didn't matter. What mattered was that you made something out of almost nothing. Something that fed everybody, and maybe even left a couple extra for tomorrow. Egg salad sandwiches were the gentle answer to a long day and an empty fridge. Hard-boiled eggs chopped and mixed with mayonnaise, a pinch of mustard, maybe celery or paprika if your mother had flair. Smeared thick onto soft white bread, wrapped in wax paper, and packed for school lunches or late-night snacks. The smell was sharp, the texture soft, the taste unmistakably homemade. These sandwiches never tried to be anything other than what they were. They were quiet, easy, and always ready. A bridge between breakfast and dinner, a standby when money was tight or the stove stayed cold. You didn't need a recipe, you needed boiled eggs, a fork, and 5 minutes. And somehow that was all it took to make something filling, something familiar, something kind. Beef and bean chili was the pot that fed the whole house and maybe even your neighbors too. It started with ground beef browned in a skillet, then mixed into a bubbling pot of kidney beans, tomatoes, onions, and whatever spices hadn't run out yet. It cooked slow. The scent filled every room. Some families added corn. Some swore by a secret spice. Others just dumped everything in and let time do the rest. Served with crackers, cornbread, or a slice of white bread, it was hot, hearty, and endlessly forgiving. Chili was the meal that welcomed leftovers, stretched across days, and tasted better the second time around. It was the comfort food of the working class, fierce, flavorful, and proud. Shepherd's pie was not just a dish, it was a plan. A bottom layer of seasoned ground beef and vegetables, topped with a cloud of mashed potatoes and baked until golden. You cut into it, and steam rose up like it had a story to tell. The meat was savory, the potatoes smooth, and every bite reminded you of warmth. This was the kind of meal that turned leftovers into a second chance. Even the potatoes might have been from the night before, whipped back to life with a splash of milk. You did not need a cookbook, just memory, instinct, and maybe your mother's voice in your head. It fed big families, tight schedules, and long winters without a word of complaint. In many homes, this was the only kind of pie anyone ever saw. It was food that used what was left and made it feel whole again. A casserole in form, but closer to a tradition in spirit. In homes with few frills, shepherd's pie was a celebration of thrift, a meal that gave more than it took. Creamed tuna on toast was the cousin of chipped beef, humble, quick, and quietly dependable. Canned tuna stirred into a thick white sauce, poured over toasted bread that had seen better days. It wasn't glamorous, but it was filling, and in the right moment, it felt like a blessing. You made it when there was nothing fresh and no energy to pretend otherwise. The sauce was simple, flour, butter, milk, but it transformed the tuna like a kind of kitchen magic. Some nights it was served in silence, not because it was bad, but because it just worked. It was the food of mothers with bills to juggle and kids to calm. Even if the toast was burnt, nobody complained. It still felt like enough. You might add peas if you had them, or melt a bit of cheese on top to stretch the flavor. The sauce clung to the bread like it belonged there, like it was always meant to turn the simplest ingredients into something warm, something that filled your stomach and your silence. Frito pie was the rebellion snack turned dinner. Crunchy corn chips layered with steaming chili and topped with shredded cheese that melted just enough. It came from the Southwest, but it conquered the country one lunch tray at a time, served in casserole dishes or right in the chip bag if you were feeling wild. It was salty, savory, crunchy, and hot. You didn't eat it with manners, you devoured it with both hands. Every bite was messy, and every bite was worth it. The cheese glued it all together, but the flavor held the memory. You knew it was not healthy, but it felt like freedom. Some nights, this was the best thing that ever came out of the kitchen. The chips stayed crisp on the edges but softened in the middle. Every bite was a little chaotic, in the best way. It wasn't elegant, but it made you smile. It was dinner that felt like cheating, and that made it feel even better. Deviled ham sandwiches were the mystery meat spread that always seemed to show up when you needed it most. Canned ham mashed into paste with mayonnaise, mustard, and a little seasoning, spread thick on slices of bread or slapped on crackers. It had a tang, a saltiness, and a weirdly satisfying punch. It didn't look like much, but it tasted like something you could trust. It was never your favorite, but it always showed up when nothing else did. That pinkish paste looked odd, but it stuck to your ribs in all the right ways. No one bragged about deviled ham, but no one threw it away either. In homes without deli meat or fresh cold cuts, this was the sandwich with staying power. It tasted like scraping by, but doing it with a little flavor, something that came through when the fridge was nearly bare. Deviled ham was survival with a little spice, a sandwich that said, "We're going to be okay," even when things felt anything but. Liver and onions was the meal that divided families and tested loyalty. Sliced liver, pan-fried with sweet onions until the smell filled the whole house. You either loved it or ran from it, but it showed up anyway. Some said it tasted like pennies, others called it rich. Your father swore it built character, and maybe he was right. You chewed slower, paused longer, and hoped for more onions. The skillet told you what was for dinner before anyone said a word. And once it was on your plate, there was no backing out. Because it was cheap, because it was full of iron, because your parents said it was good for you. And maybe it was. The onions helped. Caramelized, golden, soft. They balanced the metallic tang of the meat, tried to make it gentler. Liver and onions was not comfort food. It was character food. And if you made it through the plate, you felt just a little tougher. Meatloaf with ketchup glaze was the definition of classic comfort, a slab of ground beef mixed with breadcrumbs, onions, and egg, then topped with a thick, sweet glaze of ketchup and brown sugar. It sat in a loaf pan, sizzling as the glaze caramelized in the oven, sending out smells that filled every corner of the house. It was never flashy, but it never needed to be. This was the kind of supper that could stretch a pound of ground beef into a meal for 6. Every slice was the same, moist, tender, and sticky on top. Some families added Worcestershire or mustard, others swore by keeping it simple. Either way, it was a permanent fixture of the 1980s dinner table. It was dependable, it was nostalgic, and it somehow got better the next day in a sandwich with a slice of white bread. Parents loved it because it was easy. Kids loved it because the glaze was basically candy, and even picky eaters found something to like. In an age of frozen meals and fast food, this was a hot meal that said someone still had time to care. The origins of fried chicken are steeped in history, and while it's now a staple of Southern cuisine, it's believed to have been discovered somewhat accidentally. Early cooks, particularly in the South, were looking for ways to preserve food in an era when refrigeration was not available. They experimented with frying chicken in fat or oil, which not only helped preserve it, but also created a crispy, flavorful crust that locked in moisture. The technique of frying chicken in oil or lard was likely influenced by African cooking traditions, where deep frying was common, while the seasoning and battering method evolved from European recipes. However, it wasn't until the combination of these practices came together that fried chicken as we know it emerged. In fact, many of the earliest fried chicken recipes were simple, relying on salt, pepper, and flour to coat the chicken. Over time, regional variations began to pop up, with some cooks adding buttermilk, garlic, and spices to elevate the dish. Interestingly, fried chicken was originally considered a special occasion dish, often served during holidays or celebrations. Today, it's enjoyed year-round, and whether it's from a family recipe or a fast food bucket, this crispy delight has become a beloved part of American food culture. Elk roast was all the rage for Native American tribes. Elk is native to North America and parts of Asia, and people have relied on it as a food source for centuries. You know, back when cattle weren't common in the States. This roast was a favorite in regions where elk was abundant, and its sacred recipe was passed down from generation to generation. So, why was it such a hit back in the day? Well, apart from the tribe's sacred connections to the animal which made it a favorite, it was pretty easy to make too. It was often slow-cooked over hot coals. Think of it as modern-day barbecue, just without all the fancy grills and tools. Elk meat was replaced by more readily available options like beef and pork. It's a shame, really, because elk roast can be a delicious and healthy meal. Dr. James Salisbury was a famous 19th century physician and nutritionist who helped spread the gospel of a high-protein diet in America during a time when interests in foreign cuisine and fast food were rising. His theory was that diet could help in disease prevention, especially with things like digestive issues. He also warned people of the after-effects that a high-starch sugar diet could end up having. But simply throwing caution into the public's face would not cut it. He needed to do something to catch people's eye. That was a crucial part of people's diet needed to be lean meat, especially ground beef. He believed that a crucial part of people's diet should include lean meat, especially ground beef. Not exactly true and a habit that people would adopt, but hey, the steak is still doing numbers. Jambalaya with smoked sausage brought a little southern fire into 1980s kitchens, even if you had never stepped foot in Louisiana. Some families made it from scratch, browning sausage and simmering shrimp in a seasoned tomato broth with long grain rice and Cajun spices. Others reached for the boxed kind, adding smoked sausage slices and calling it a day. Either way, it packed bold flavor into a single skillet. The rice soaked up every bit of the spicy tomato base, and the sausage gave it a smoky punch that made each bite feel special. It was not fancy, but it tasted like something bigger than it was. Jambalaya let you pretend you were cooking something exotic, even if it came together in 30 minutes on a weeknight. You could tweak it however you liked: more shrimp, no shrimp, hot sauce, bell peppers, celery, garlic. It was flexible and full of heart. It warmed you up, filled you up, and made you feel like a real cook, even if all you did was stir. In a decade full of shortcuts and pre-packed meals, Jambalaya still found a way to feel fresh, fiery, and totally unforgettable. Beginning of the 20th century, an 11-year-old boy named Frank Epperson accidentally invented what would become one of the world's favorite frozen treats. One night, after mixing soda powder and water in a cup, Frank left it outside on his porch with a stirring stick still inside. The temperature dropped overnight, and by morning, Frank found that his mixture had frozen solid, stick and all. Instead of throwing it away, he pulled it from the cup, and the frozen treat was born. Frank didn't immediately recognize the significance of his discovery, but he did begin to make the frozen treat regularly, calling it an epsicle, a combination of his last name and the word icicle. Years later, when Frank's children began calling it popsicle, the name stuck, and the frozen dessert went on to gain worldwide popularity. Interestingly, Frank initially made the frozen treat using soda flavors, but over time, it evolved into the fruity, colorful popsicles we know today. The simple innovation of freezing flavored liquids with a stick in the middle turned out to be a genius solution for a refreshing treat that could be eaten on the go. Barbecue meatballs over rice was sticky, sweet, and surprisingly elegant for something made with grape jelly. The meatballs were simple: ground beef, breadcrumbs, egg, maybe a dash of onion or garlic powder. Rolled, baked, and then dropped into a bubbling pot of barbecue sauce. Sometimes that sauce was just bottled barbecue. Sometimes it was a wild mix of ketchup, jelly, and mustard that should not have worked, but somehow always did. The sauce coated the meatballs in a glaze so thick, it practically begged for a bed of white rice to soak it all up. This was not party food. It was Tuesday night food that tasted like a celebration. It was filling, sticky in the best way, and so easy to make ahead. Families loved it because it used cheap ingredients. Kids loved it because it tasted like candy in dinner form. It looked like something you would get at a church supper or potluck, served from a giant aluminum tray. But at home, it meant something a little more personal. It meant comfort. Braised oxtail is proof that our ancestors really knew how to make the most of every part of an animal. An oxtail typically weighs around 8 pounds and is skinned and cut into shorter lengths for this Italian cuisine. This meat is slow-cooked in red wine and braised with vegetables such as carrots, tomatoes, and even lima beans. Oxtail is packed with collagen, so this dish was also used by many women of the Victorian era for younger-looking skin. Many women used to throw parties just to serve it. They took "eat your skincare" to a whole other level. While the word once meant only the tail of an ox, today it can also refer to the tails of other cattle. Today, this dish is a gourmet delicacy, but back in the day, it was every middle-class worker's dream. Chicken cordon bleu casserole was the shortcut supper that turned a fancy French dish into a creamy, weeknight-friendly bake. You started with chopped chicken, leftover or canned. Add in cubed ham, a few slices of Swiss cheese, and a rich sauce made from sour cream or cream of chicken soup. It all went into a casserole dish and got baked until bubbly and golden on top. No stuffing, no rolling, just the flavors of chicken cordon bleu without the effort. This dish felt grown up, but it was easy enough for anyone to make. It tasted like something from a restaurant, even if it came from a bag of shredded cheese and a can of soup. It was a go-to for potlucks, holiday leftovers, or a random Tuesday night when you wanted something cozy but a little bit elevated. If your mother ever made it, you remember how the ham melted into the sauce and how the Swiss gave it that sharp edge that kept you coming back. Some sources tell us that Lemuel Benedict, a notable Wall Street broker, took a trip to the Waldorf Hotel in New York City, and he was suffering from one of the worst hangovers of his life. He asked the staff for the ingredients to what would eventually make up an Eggs Benedict, and the chef at the time, who was either Oscar Cherky or Charles Ronhofer, became pretty impressed with the list of ingredients. They ended up modifying a little and adding it to the menu of the hotel, and in honor of Lemuel, they decided to call it an Eggs Benedict. There are also rumors suggesting that Ronhofer created the dish at Delmonico's, a popular restaurant for influential people and politicians. There were two regular customers called Ms. and Mrs. Legrand Benedict, and it is said he made it for them, but the Waldorf Hotel story is the one most people buy as the truth. Macaroni and cheese with hot dogs was childhood in a bowl. You started with Kraft or Velveeta, stirred it until the cheese sauce turned bright orange and glossy, then dropped in sliced hot dogs and let the magic happen. It was salty, it was creamy, and it was a guaranteed win with kids who were otherwise impossible to feed. Some families added ketchup, some added peas, but most just kept it simple and let the cheese and dogs do all the work. It came together in 15 minutes. It cost next to nothing, and it felt like a reward at the end of the day. You could eat it on the couch, at the table, or straight from the pot. There were no rules. It was the dinner that babysitters made, that exhausted parents relied on, that kids learned to cook for themselves. It was not fancy, but it was honest. And that is what made it last. Macaroni and cheese with hot dogs was a dish that knew exactly what it was and never tried to be anything else. Coconut shrimp curry tacos were actually something you'd see dominating the New York food circuit. Either that or California and coastal cities. It just seemed to vibe so well in places that had established a pre-existing love for Caribbean and Mediterranean influences and flavors. While these flavors were never exactly new in any regard, especially not exclusive to the cities I mentioned or the decade we're talking about, seeing them together was definitely a stretch. Shrimp, curry, and coconut were all things most Americans were familiar with, but never something that was put together in one dish. Especially a dish as densely packed and intimate as a taco. I mean, you really taste everything in a taco, don't you? How can you not? Luckily, you had plenty of options. The shrimp could either be fried or sautéed, and it could either be coated in shredded coconut or made in coconut milk. Then, you had the curry, which was also a coconut curry. Now, I'm not really the biggest fan of coconut curry, but it's been known to work well for the Burmese and the Indians. Why can't it work for us? Throw all of that in some white flour tortillas and you're pretty much good to go. It was a street food classic, and despite how it's pretty much faded because lots of other more closer to home variants came out in terms of flavor, people from the 90s know this used to be a hit. Teriyaki chicken with minute rice was weeknight takeout without the takeout bag. Soy sauce, brown sugar, garlic, and pineapple juice turned simple chicken into a sticky sweet masterpiece. It was cooked in a skillet or electric wok, poured over hot, fluffy minute rice, and eaten straight from the plate while steam curled into the kitchen light. It felt exotic back then, sweet, salty, and just a little tangy. Teriyaki was not yet everywhere, so having it at home felt like a treat. Bottled marinades were popular, but homemade versions became kitchen staples too. Families made it with chicken breasts or thighs, depending on what was in the freezer. Pineapple chunks were often tossed in for extra sweetness. It was not just fast, it was festive. You got a colorful plate, an easy cleanup, and a dinner that actually made you smile. It looked glossy, smelled amazing, and made your weeknight feel a little more like a celebration. Teriyaki chicken with minute rice was fusion without realizing it. It gave American families a taste of something new, dressed up in ingredients they already knew how to use. It was sweet, it was easy, and it was too good to forget. Mediterranean nachos are probably the most contrasting thing I could put next to Thai curry pizza. On one hand, you have that pizza, which was just a good moment for like 9 out of 10 people. On the other hand, you have Mediterranean nachos, which are a perfect example of how you take from a culture and mix it with your own to create something truly special. Here, you had all the beautiful things and flavors you would typically come to associate with Mediterranean cuisine, such as hummus, tzatziki, grilled meats, and the freshest olives you'll ever see. Then you have Mexican goodness in the form of the best nachos you've ever had. What do you get? One of the best party foods of the 1900s overall, and definitely of the 1990s. It became such a massive party snack that lots of restaurants started incorporating Mediterranean nachos into their menus and specials so that people who were needing to buy in bulk could always have options. That was where the money was to be made, you know? Plus, since it was definitely the in thing to do, lots of contemporary places gave it a fair bit of spotlight too. Baked ziti with Jared sauce was the Italian-American supper that could feed an army without breaking a sweat. It was not lasagna, but it hit all the same notes: gooey cheese, rich tomato sauce, and plenty of pasta. Ziti noodles were cooked just until tender, then tossed with store-bought marinara or meat sauce. Italian sausage or meatballs often joined the party. Everything got layered into a baking dish with shredded mozzarella and sometimes a bit of parmesan on top. Into the oven it went, bubbling until the edges were crisp and the cheese was pulling in every direction. It was hearty, cheap, and perfect for leftovers. Baked ziti was a weeknight miracle. It could be made in bulk, served at potlucks, or frozen for later. You knew what you were getting every single time, and that consistency made it one of the most loved casseroles of the 1980s. It was red-sauced joy, one scoop at a time. Some families added ricotta, some skipped the meat, but everyone had a version. In the 1980s, a Vietnamese immigrant named David Tran was trying to recreate a traditional hot sauce from his home country, but he ended up making something entirely different and delicious. After moving to the United States, Tran wanted to make the kind of hot sauce he had grown up with, but when he combined fresh chilies, garlic, vinegar, and sugar, something unexpected happened. The sauce he created had a unique balance of heat and sweetness, which turned out to be a winning combination. Tran initially sold the sauce to local Asian markets, but it wasn't long before word spread. People began to recognize that this sauce was unlike any other, with a perfect punch of heat and flavor that paired well with everything from pho to pizza. Tran had unintentionally created Sriracha sauce, a now world-famous condiment known for its vibrant red color and signature rooster logo. What's interesting is that Sriracha is named after a coastal town in Thailand where a similar style of hot sauce is made, but Tran's version was completely his own creation. His sauce, made in Los Angeles, quickly caught on and became a global sensation. And the best part was it all happened by accident, proving that sometimes the best recipes come from happy mistakes. Spaghetti with Italian sausage was how pasta night grew up in the 1980s. It was a step above plain marinara, a little richer, a little more rustic. Italian sausage, mild or spicy, was browned and broken up into chunky pieces, then simmered in red sauce until every bite was soaked in flavor. The sauce took on the fennel and garlic from the meat. It clung to the spaghetti like it belonged there. This was not a kid's dinner. It was messy, bold, and made you want to mop the plate with a piece of bread when it was done. Parmesan on top was a must. Sometimes fresh basil, if you were lucky. It was hearty enough to count as a full meal. No side dishes needed. Parents loved it because it was quick and satisfying. Teenagers loved it because it tasted like something you would order at a restaurant. Even if you used jarred sauce and boxed noodles, the sausage made it feel special. This was dinner that made noise, from the sizzle of the pan to the scrape of forks at the end. Spaghetti with Italian sausage was not just food, it was the soundtrack of real family meals. In 1930, James Dewar, a baker at the Continental Baking Company, was working on a recipe for cream-filled shortcakes. But a mistake in the process led to a happy accident that would create one of America's most iconic snacks, the Twinkie. Dewar intended to use a shortcake as the base for his cream filling, but when that batch failed, he turned to a sponge cake instead. This spongy, light cake held the cream perfectly, and the Twinkie was born. The snack was initially marketed as a temporary treat during the Great Depression when strawberries weren't in season, and the cream filling could stand in as a sweet replacement. It was originally sold in packs of 2, and its yellow sponge cake and creamy center became an instant hit. What makes Twinkies so unforgettable is their shelf life. An urban legend even claimed they could last for decades. While that's been exaggerated, they certainly have a reputation for longevity. They've evolved over the years, but the original formula still holds strong, making Twinkies a nostalgic favorite for generations. From an accidental swap of ingredients to a snack that has survived the test of time, Twinkies prove that sometimes the best things come from unexpected changes. Tuna noodle casserole was either your favorite or your nightmare, but either way, it showed up often and meant you were home. The formula never changed. Egg noodles, canned tuna, frozen peas, and cream of mushroom soup all stirred together and baked until hot and thick. The finishing move? A crunchy crown of crushed potato chips, sometimes cornflakes, always something salty and golden. It came in a square dish that seemed bottomless. You would scoop out a portion and find yourself going back for more because it was weirdly addictive. Cheap, filling, and shelf-stable, it became the undisputed champion of weeknight meals for families trying to stretch $1. Some versions added chopped celery or onion. Others stayed true to the original, built on cans and carbs. It was a casserole that smelled like your grandmother's house. It could feed a family of 6 on pennies. And it tasted like a relic of a time when everything came from the pantry and nobody cared if the tuna was fancy. Remember how we talked about peach Melbas and how they were the second thing Auguste Escoffier named after Dame Melba? He was a devout and passionate adorer of her work, and he definitely had a delicious way of expressing it. One day, while she was performing at the Covent Garden House in London, she was staying at the Savoy Hotel where Escoffier happened to be the head chef. He knew his chance as soon as he saw it, and after her performance in Lohengrin, he made a dessert that was just for her. This was the very first version of the peach Melbas, which had a swan-shaped ice structure in the middle as its most noticeable trait, besides the flavor, of course, which Dame ended up loving thoroughly. Chicken and rice. Bake with cream of mushroom soup was the casserole that cooked while you did anything else. Dump a few boneless chicken breasts into a baking dish. Add white rice, a can of cream of mushroom soup, and some water or broth. Stir, cover, bake. That was it. The rice soaked up all the flavor from the soup and the chicken, turning soft and creamy while the top browned just enough to give it texture. You would take off the foil and suddenly, dinner was ready. It did not ask for attention. It just quietly got the job done. If your parents worked long hours, this was the kind of meal that waited patiently in the oven. It was never flashy, but it was always there. It fed everyone at the table, left you full, and saved your family from another night of fast food. Chicken and rice bake was not about bold flavors or eye-catching colors. It was about consistency. It was about stretching a few cans and a handful of rice into something warm and whole. And somehow, it always worked. For those of you who are foodies and diehard patriots and/or traditionalists, spaghetti pizza casserole might either be blasphemy to your ears and eyes, or it might be the first relieved sigh you take throughout this video. So, some of you might be asking right now why people as a collective gave each other the green light to start putting spaghetti along with pizza in a casserole. Other people, of course, are questioning why this wasn't done sooner. It's meat, and you know that works with casseroles. It's cheese, and you know that's literally a default requirement for casseroles. It's spaghetti, which isn't really your first option for a casserole filling, but it's been known to work in more than one region. By the 1980s, casserole dishes had experienced a massive revival, but that was arguably really short-lived. Pizza, on the other hand, had really become the proverbial piñata of the fusion food movement. It seemed like if there was ever an idea worth trying, you'd apply it on pizza first, then on literally everything else. Spaghetti pizza casserole was an extremely heavy and filling mashup of two iconic standalone dishes, but it was also a really divisive one. That probably does explain why you don't see much of it today, and I think that also settles the argument. It wasn't good enough to last through time. Pork chops and applesauce might sound like something from the 1970s, but it had real staying power into the 1980s. It was the kind of meal that felt both retro and reliable. Pork chops, pan-fried in a little butter or oil, were the centerpiece. Thin cut or bone-in, sometimes breaded, sometimes not. They were not fancy, but when they were seasoned well and seared just right, they brought serious flavor. The applesauce came on the side, often from a jar, sweet and cold against the warmth of the meat. Some people thought it was strange, others thought it was genius. The sweet and savory contrast worked better than expected. It gave the dish balance, simplicity, a little surprise. If your mother grew up on it, chances are she passed it down without changing a thing. Pork chops and applesauce did not need a lot of ingredients or time. It needed a skillet, a jar, and a family willing to sit at the table together. That was the magic of it. Fried green tomato sliders are also another example of what I was talking about, except these showcase how portion control and appetizers were pretty much all people knew how to focus on. These were really popular in places like South Carolina and Alabama or Georgia, mostly because these places had a real knack for green tomatoes and a history of growing them, but they had faded into irrelevancy. While green tomatoes were obviously still in use, the fried version was something people had left behind. Fusion food was bringing back all sorts of wonders for people, though, so it was no surprise that this classic got revisited as well. While you'd typically see it in southern restaurants and places known for their salads, sliders, and entrees, you wouldn't really see it too much outside those settings, which led to it being a bit of an underrepresented dish. It couldn't really keep its momentum, and ended up just going back to the benches again. Salisbury steak TV dinners were the one microwave meal that felt like a real supper, at least through the eyes of a hungry kid. The beef patties were tenderish, floating in thick brown gravy next to a scoop of mashed potatoes and a rectangle of corn. Sometimes there was a brownie hiding in the corner. It was a plastic tray of small comforts. The sound of that plastic film peeling back after the microwave dinged was almost ceremonial. You sat cross-legged on the carpet, TV glowing, fork in hand. The meat may have been spongy and the potatoes from a powder, but in the moment, it tasted like everything you needed. This was independence for a generation raised on fast solutions. Your parents were busy, you were hungry, and this box from the freezer aisle gave you a meal and a few minutes of peace. The packaging always promised home style, but really, it was its own thing. Straight out of the royal family's dinner table, beef Wellington was a beef steak dish with the perfect regal twist. This delicacy was made of a tender beef fillet coated with pâté and duxelles, then wrapped in puff pastry, which made it just as fancy as it sounds. It was traditionally served with a rich red wine sauce, such as a Madeira or Cabernet Sauvignon reduction. Now, the origin of this meal is shrouded in history, but it is suggested that it emerged in England in the 19th century and was named after the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley. This steak required a lot of time and patience, which made it a meal for only the royals of England. It's a part of ancient history now, but you might be able to taste it if you make your way to Regal Balls or a Michelin star restaurant in London. Taco salad in a Doritos bag was the definition of fun food, half salad, half chaos, and all 1980s genius. The setup was simple. Ground beef cooked with taco seasoning, shredded lettuce, cheddar cheese, maybe some diced tomatoes or sour cream, and a big handful of nacho cheese Doritos. Some families mixed it all in a bowl. Others, the bold ones, served it straight from the bag. You would crunch up the chips, pour in the toppings, shake it up, and dig in with a fork. It was portable. It was messy. It was delicious. And it felt like breaking the rules in the best way. This was dinner that did not sit properly on a plate. It made kids excited to eat salad. It gave busy parents a break. And it tasted like everything good about the 1980s. Salty, cheesy, just a little bit ridiculous. You could call it a meal, a snack, or a party trick. But however it showed up, it never lasted long. Taco salad in a Doritos bag was food with a wink. If one of these suppers ever sat warm on your childhood table, tell us in the comments, then like the video, subscribe for more forgotten favorites, and help us keep these kitchen memories alive.